So without further ado, I'd like to ask Michel up to the stage, and I'd like to introduce him as our 2012-2013 SCP president. Michel?
Thank you so much, Darren. This is awfully kind and awfully generous of you. And when I knew that Darren was the next one after me, I must say that I was considering about changing the tradition and go back to having the previous president do the introduction, because I knew what Vicky might do. Darren, you never know what he's going to do. But it was not too bad. There's some truth to what he said, by the way, but there's a lot of false positives, so that you know, okay? Let me see if I can get my mouse to work. All right, so I just want to, first of all, thank you all for giving me a chance to help the organizations and to work for it. It's been a terrific pleasure to work with many of you over the last couple of years, first as president-elect and then this past year. And I mean, we have a great organization with a lot of energy in it, and that's fantastic. I think, thank you all for giving me this opportunity to work for you in this past 24 months or so. What I thought I'd do today is something a bit what many people doing in their addresses is sort of reflect a bit on the field, tell you where I think we are, things that we could celebrate, things that we could improve on, and for whatever I raise that need to be improved on, provide some suggestions on how we might be able to be better, even better as an organization, and as a field overall that I will define as consumer psychology. So let's first talk about the great stuff that we have to celebrate as a field. First of all, we have to be really aware that the world out there is really open to behavioral sciences, more so than they were 20 years ago. And that's very encouraging for us, because the world of practice, the world of policy making is really open to what we have to contribute as a field. Obviously, we have grown dramatically as a field, both in terms of members, conference attendance, manuscript submissions, outlets where we can publish. This is good stuff. We should be very happy about that. On some measures, we have become also more rigorous as a field. You can sort of see that in the depth of our theorizing that we bring to the papers that we write. You can see that also in the methodological sophistications that we apply to the research, the papers that we publish. The last thing that I think is we should be even the most proud of and the most happy about is the fact that our field has become, since I've been in this field, very much more inclusive than it used to be. 20 years ago or so, very few people, and always the same names, will be appearing in the top journals in our field. Nowadays, I'm very happy to pick up an issue of JCR or JCP, and I won't recognize most of the names there. And that's very, very good. It means that we have somehow trickled down, and a lot more people participate in the field at the top level, and including people from a lot of international institutions, and that's very, very good. So we are a maturing field, and so we also deserve to and ought to be somehow accurate and diagnostic and fair with where we stand. And I'd like to suggest that we need to have a second look on this issue of relevance. And I'd like to pick up on the address that Jeff Inman made at ACR a few months ago, where he also actually raised this issue of relevance. How relevant are we as a field? And I'd like to sort of describe it along a 2x2 matrix, which is, by the way, session 1 in my experimental design class. They are a little 2x2, and you can think of relevance as having an external dimension and an internal dimension. The external one has to do with, are we relevant toward our external constituents? The world of business, most of us are in business school, the world of policy making, the world of consumers that exist out there, outside our lab. How relevant are we? The other dimension has to do with the internal dimensions of relevance. How relevant are we to ourselves? How relevant are we to other academics who work in related disciplines? So where are we in this table? Okay, I think you pretty much can rule out some cells already in this table. I think as Jeff Inman raised, and many people before Jeff did, and this has been an ongoing problem for our field for the last 20, 30 years or so is that on the external relevance dimension, we're just not as good as we should be. Okay? Not enough of our research is applied, is applicable, even though we might be mentioned once in a while in the Wall Street Journal, whatever. This is not changing the world as well as it could be. So if you're not on the right-hand side of this chart, where do we stack on the left column? I'd like to show you a chart here, which I constructed recently, which is a citation chart of articles that were published in Journal of Consumer Research between the year 2004-2008. I wanted the data to be fairly recent, but not too recent, so that at least citation is somewhat stable. I ranked order the articles from the most cited to the least cited. The citations that I have here are citations per year, so that I can somehow control for the fact that, of course, there's an effect of seniority in terms of citation. So if you look at a chart like this, I think two things should strike you. The first thing is that some papers get very well cited. Okay? One paper out there, 30 citations per year, that's terrific. A bunch of papers get 10 or more citations per year, this is very good. But the other side of the story is to look at the other side of the chart. And you will should be noticing that about 70% of our articles, 70% of our articles get 3 citations or less per year. And to be honest, and to be clear, those include mine in there. Okay? So I'm not preaching here, I'm just like everybody else here. I have a bunch of them really in the tail of that distribution. Okay? Now this is not a recent phenomenon. If you go back 10 years in time, this is the 10-year period before that, you have exactly the same data pattern. So essentially, few articles get published very well. I think the top 15% of the article get cited very well. The top 15% of the articles get probably 45% of citations. The bottom 50 get maybe 20% of citations. Okay? So roughly 70% of the stuff we do is not even interesting to ourselves. Okay? So if you go back to this chart here, I'm afraid that the bad news that I have to convey to you is that we're awfully close to the lower or upper left cell of this chart. Not as relevant externally, not as relevant as we should be internally. So that is the bad news. I have some good news, because I think I have a path. Okay? And I'm going to provide some suggestions on how we might be able to increase our relevance both on the internal dimension as well as on the external dimension, because I think those two things go hand in hand. And I thought about this issue for quite some time, and I think it all goes down to a series of problems that are endemic in our field. Mistakes we keep committing over and over again, and they are not totally independent, but they each deserve to be caught and somehow noticed and addressed separately. I call them collectively the 7 sins of consumer psychology. Okay. Now, the point I'm going to make is that if you want to put my research in this chart, I'm right at the center. Okay? I have committed them all. Okay? And most of us have committed the same sin. So I'm very happy and comfortable to share them with you because I'm as guilty as anybody else. So I'm going to do the David Letterman stuff. I'm going to go from the bottom up, give you the number 7, and then we'll go to the top 1. Okay? Let's start with sin number 1. Research by convenience. This is the title of an article that was published by Ron Ferber many years ago, I think 1977, in the Journal of Consumer Research. And what Ron Ferber was complaining back then was saying, we're using too much students as a surrogate for consumers. That makes a lot of sense, of course. Now, have we moved along from that? Well, the truth is that probably not that much. This is the world that we claim to be studying, the role of real consumers operating in real marketplaces. The truth is that what we are doing is mostly something like on the right-hand side, where we use students, we use mechanical Turks, people who are willing to work for $2 an hour, okay, to just fill out meaningless surveys. And we are using way too often scenarios and things like that as opposed to real consumer behavior. We know that's true. We know it's true, and so much of my research is based on these type of paradigms. We're all guilty of that. So what does that mean? It means that we have to be much more encouraging, much more supportive, and much more patient with research that is really grounded in the field. Field studies, maybe we should not ask them 5 experiments. Just give them 1 experiment, 1 study, as opposed to having and social demands, this must be much more supportive and appreciative to field studies than we have been. Sin number 2 on my list is number 6 here. I think there's a major problem in our field that's contributing to that long tail I just described, which is a confusion between what I call theories of studies with studies of theories. Too much of our research is essentially based on conceptualization of something that's happening under very narrow conditions in the world that we create in the lab. So let me describe what I mean by a theory of study. This is a very plausible theory of study. Okay? Previous research has shown that when consumers are hungry, they tend to purchase more in a supermarket than when they are not hungry. However, suppose that they are primed with either the concept of indulgence or the concept of self-control. We predict that hungry consumers primed with indulgence will purchase more than consumers who are not hungry. However, hungry consumers primed with self-control will not purchase more than consumers who are not hungry. This is because we can fill in the blank. So this is study number 1. Pretty likely study number 2. Now suppose that half the participants are asked to remember a 7-digit number, and the other half are asked to remember a 2-digit number. Now we predict a 3-way interaction, showing that among participants with low cognitive loads, the results of the previous studies will be replicated. In contrast, among participants with a high cognitive load, hungry participants will not purchase more regardless of whether they are primed with indulgence or self-control. Now, this study does not exist. It's not been published at least, and I hope I did not describe anybody's research right now. Okay? But if you look at read this study carefully, you will recognize that it has a lot of the ingredients of what it takes to be published in our top journals. Okay? You take an existing finding that's pretty well accepted, robust, you combine it with another one, so there's grounded literature, you make a logical connection. You use a methodological paradigm that's well validated out there, you bring it to the lab, and if the researchers are clever enough and conscientious enough, it's going to be very tough to come up with a better explanation for that findings than what they are proposing. And in my own observation, those papers are very hard to reject. They tend to penetrate our journals at a very high rate. The only reason you can reject, the only way you can reject a paper like this is if a pretty rude reviewer steps his or her foot down and says, you know what, that's not interesting. But most of us are way too polite to do that. Okay? And then the result of that is that we end up having too many theories of studies in our journals as opposed to things that are really telling us something true outside the lab, outside the mini world that we are creating artificially in our lab. Okay? So beware of not confusing theories of studies with what we should be studying, studies of theories. Sin number 5, a sin of overgeneralization. And that's a sin very common, and this is the way our mind and our brain works. We generalize, we make associations. And this is a sin that we do commit both as authors as well as reviewers. As authors, we collect data. And as you know, all of you, when you run experiments, it's tough. Okay? You have to do calibrated stimuli, you have to think very carefully about the way you phrase your questions, you have to pilot test, you might have to run experiments a couple of times before it works. Okay? And once we get it to work, what happens in our mind? All of a sudden, the finding and our interpretation of the finding takes a life of its own. And we start believing that the results that we just obtained are so much more generalizable than they are because we've just forgotten how hard it was to obtain the findings to begin with. Now this is a sin that we commit not just as authors, it's a sin we commit also as reviewers and as readers of the literature. I sort of like to read the literature, I like to read it somewhat carefully, and I don't read as much as I should, but I've noticed that it's a pattern in the way we read the literature. There's a previous finding out there that's been published by some other researcher. How do we read this? We read the finding, read the paper, and never get a big picture. Now what happens to our interpretation of that finding? It expands. Okay? We overgeneralize way beyond what the finding was originally. I'll give you one finding. It's a paper that I love. It's a great finding. The paper by Shina and Gar on the tumor choice effects. That's the famous jam in the supermarket study. Okay? Well, most of us are very familiar with that study. Very important finding, very important paper. Okay? The If you read that paper carefully, read it again, you will find that the original result was produced under very narrow conditions. Okay? First of all, there was only a single brand in the choice set that she was using. The other things, all familiar flavors, the stuff that you would normally like, were removed from the choice set. You only had esoteric flavors that people had to choose from. Now you have a single brand, esoteric flavor that you could not differentiate, then you can get too much choice effect. But once the result, and they were very careful to disclose that in the paper and then specify the conditions under which you get that effect. But once the paper was published, what happened? The finding took a life of its own. And all these reviewers kept telling him, you know what, we know that too much choice is very bad. Well, actually, it's not true. We don't know that. A meta-analysis that was published recently in Journal of Consumer Research shows that out of 60 studies that were conducted since then, maybe 10 of them, 15 might show the effect, another 10 showed exactly the opposite, and there's somewhere 30 or so just no effect. So we don't know that. And we have to avoid overgeneralizing, both as authors as well as reviewers, so that we don't get into this problem of we already know that, or we already know the opposite, or we tell the authors, you know what, that replication study, just drop it because we already show that. Okay? Very, very bad practice that we need to move away from. Much more insistence on replications, robustness tests, and much more precision in our generalizations. Sin number 4, narrow scope. The major impediment in the progress of our field in terms of relevance had to do with what we call consumer behavior. If I were to ask you to define what is consumer behavior, most of you would give me a definition like this. You will say it's about a set of processes by which consumers come to learn about, desire, acquire, use, and dispose of goods, services, and activities available in the marketplace to satisfy their needs. Okay, most of you had that kind of definition in the back of your mind. That's pretty much almost textbook-like. Now, I'd like you to put that in a picture. Okay? So what does that mean? It means that the kind of stuff we could be studying go all the way from the left side of this chart, from the activation of a need, a desire among consumers, and then there's such a set of activities that involve acquisition-related behavior, and then there's a consumption proper that takes place, and then there's a stage of divestment, disposal that takes place. Now, where is our research in that entire chart? You know, if you review the journal, that the vast majority of what we do, 70% of what we do, is concentrated in that part of the chart. About one mode of acquisition, which is about purchase related. This is just one mode of acquisition. There are other modes of acquisition that are very important. There's a lot of stealing, for example. Okay? 1 in 11 people is a shoplifter, according to some statistics. Okay? Huge industries that we actually have not looked at. Now, why do we study purchase? Okay? And I think it has to do with the mistaken conception of what is relevant to marketers outside. We think, well, when it's purchase related, it's going to be more relevant for marketers. The reality is that if you talk to marketers, I think they often tell you they know what's happening in purchase. The thing that predicts purchase, they know quite well. What they would like to know more about is what happens in consumption. Because they realize that, at consumption is really the point at which I create value and I can make a difference. What are the obstacles to consumption? What are the rituals that are happening? What's happening when people are using or not using my product? This is something that marketers are very interested in. The other thing that marketers are very interested in is what happens earlier in this chart, in the desire stage. Think about most of the way we conceptualize our studies, the need of the consumers are taken as exogenous. We assume that the consumer needs it. We say, assume consumers that you want to go on a vacation, I show you 3 packages, which one we choose. That assumption is actually very important. Marketers just want to know, what makes people want something, what makes people actually need something, what people actually make not need something, not recognize the needs. Some of the most important contributions we can make as a field is trying to understand really what's happening in the earlier stage, the generation of the need. I'll give you an example. There's a company that you may have heard of called De Beers. De Beers makes diamonds. And one of the fabulous stories of marketing over the last 50, 60 years is the ability by this company to create a need for diamonds out of thin air. Nobody needs diamonds, objectively. Nobody needs it. It's not even valuable. Okay? But they created this myth. This is something now, something that everybody knows, but that everybody needs. Okay? How can you create a need like that from scratch? What are the boundary conditions? We don't know. We have no theory in order to be able to study that. And this is something that has obviously enormous relevance for the work out there. The next sin on my list, number 3, will be a sin of narrow lens. And that's something I think you probably know already. If you look at our journals, not only we are narrow in what we study, we're also narrow in the perspective that we use to study these things. Okay, so we have narrow lenses. Most of our research, 70% probably, is dictated by 3 dominant paradigms, 3 dominant literatures. Cognitive psychology, social psychology with a strong attitude and social cognition bent, and the third one is behavioral research. 70% or more of the articles that gets published in our journals comes from these 3 sets of lenses. Now, if you look at the big picture of theorizing that you can make about consumer behavior, you will realize that we're just tapping a very small subset, which I call the mechanical core at the center of this chart. It's the machinery that consumers have, and it's true that's an important machinery of how the information gets as an input, transforms as a process, and then produce a result. That's important, but there's lots of other stuff beyond that machinery. Feelings and emotions, to which I devoted a lot of my research, motivational dimensions, goals, values, motives, drives, beyond that, things beyond the boundaries of the self, social, relational context, the overall family background, the cultural background, all those things beyond that is also important. And we tend to leave it out because we conceive of psychology too narrowly. We think of psychology is the core of these things. While it turns out there's lots of psychology that exists at different levels, and we're not tapping into these other psychologies, like cultural psychology, that that speak at the more molar level as opposed to the more molecular level. Okay? We're also guilty of a narrow lens in one of pervasive problems we have in our field, which is obsession with unique explanation. Right? You cannot make a theoretical contribution unless you're able to demonstrate the unique explanation. Okay? And I don't think it's very healthy, because first of all, you have to realize that many interesting phenomena, some of the most important ones, are in fact most likely multiply determined. Think about the attraction effect, think about what Tom Gillerich described yesterday between happiness that comes from experiences versus happiness from material goods. All those things that are very fundamental, very important, are multiply determined. That's why they're big, that's why they're worth studying. The other reason why you should think more broadly than just having a narrow, unique explanation is, explanation exists at multiple levels, and that's okay. You might have a BET phenomenon, mental accounting phenomenon that is driven by an attention shift. That attention shift is maybe driven by motivational processes. Those motivational processes may be grounded in some cultural norms, whatever, but accept the fact that theoretical explanations can exist at multiple levels and be complementary rather than alternative. And finally, let's not forget that theory is just a theory. It's no big deal. Okay? The theory is just a lens that we use to interpret a set of data in a way that's coherent, that has some level of generalizability. That's all it is. It's not a statement of absolute truth. Okay? And you can still see that very well in siblings in psychology. There's this great book by Shelley Chaikin and Yakov Trope that's called Dual Process Theories in Social Psychology. So if you open the book, you will find it's a collection of chapters that contains about 20 or so, 25 dual process theories of everything, of impression formation, attitude formation, stereotyping, judgment decision making, so on and so forth. And the point is that those theories are all, they're not independent, they make somewhat correlated predictions. You cannot disentangle them perfectly, but you don't need to. As long as they each provide a useful way of looking at the data that makes it some sense out of data, they are allowed to coexist. So this will be very helpful and healthy for us to be more tolerant of alternative way of explaining the data as opposed to be looking for the unique single best explanation. Sin number 2. I think we are narrow also in our epistemology. And by epistemology, I mean we're narrow in the way we define consumer knowledge and knowledge about consumers, and in the way we prescribe how you generate that knowledge. Most of the knowledge that we produce in our field tend to be relational knowledge that is derived in a theory-driven fashion. So it's built based on a hypothetical deductive path, which means that people generate some relation between constructs that exist at a theoretical level, combine them, then generate a hypothesis that is tested against data that is supposed to map onto some phenomena of interest. Okay? This is 70% of the literature is like that, and as John Lynch and others have pointed out recently, one of the drawbacks of that paradigm for doing research, which is rigorous and tight, is the fact that very often there's a mapping to the phenomena. It's not very good. It's really a stretch. It looks very much like pure psychology, not real consumer behavior because of the path we have chosen. Now, more recently, as you know, people have advocated a phenomenon-driven approach, where you're on an inductive path whereby you start from the data and from which you can infer some generalizable phenomenon, or recurrent phenomenon, that from which you can try to generate an explanation. And I personally haven't done that much, but I think it's good. I think it's very healthy for the field to have this bottom-up path for doing research, provided two things take place. First of all, the phenomenon has to be robust. We have to be very careful. The phenomenon has to be robust. And second, it has to be relevant for consumer behavior. I'd like to suggest two other ways of building research in our field that don't get enough attention in my mind, in my own opinion. The first one is the path of what we might call who cares about why. Okay? It's about descriptive research, or we might call descriptive. We sort of look down, poo-poo, on papers that we describe as descriptive. But I would surmise to you that some of the most important findings in consumer behavior today are papers that are primarily descriptive. Think about Hoyer's findings, that people spend much less time in the supermarket when looking at the shelf than we thought they were doing based on our own theorizing. Think about Hauser's findings that consideration set size is limited, very stable across product categories, and account for 75–78% of the variance in choice. Very important finding. We don't care about why, but it's a very important finding in and of itself. I'm also a big fan of Brian Wansink's work, because you look at his work on how different situational cues, such as having a larger plate, smaller plate, having potato chips inserted in between them, regulate consumption. I don't care about the process, and Brian, I don't think cares that much, but he shouldn't, because the findings themselves are super important. Okay? So we should be much more tolerant as a field for research that we consider to be descriptive, because description of real important phenomena is something that we should that is very helpful, not just to us, but to the world beyond us. There's another path that I'd like to suggest, and that's something that I don't think I've seen written before, something I call the inspired validation path. One of the problems we have in our field is that we are very good at building theories from constructs and then making a tight test. We're not very good at linking the data and the theories to the right set of phenomena. Now, there are other people that I think are very good at the opposite. Okay? There are people who can have a good eye for real phenomena and somehow connecting them to interesting theories, but they're very bad at testing them. They're very bad at submitting them to real data. So the people I'm referring to are advancing speculations, and the people, I don't know if you have a hint in your mind, thinking about industry consultants. If you look at the industries, there's lots of people out there who make a lot of money, making claims about consumption behavior, and saying, and receiving a lot of money for that, advancing various types of theories, with no data. Okay? Give you one example. A very popular theory that you have in the industry is the theory of brand archetypes. The idea is as follows. Okay? There are stylized personas that we have in the back of our mind, our subconscious, such as we have a mental representation for a rebel, we have a mental representation for an explorer, we have a mental representation for a magician. And all these semi-mythical figures exist in our subconscious, and whenever a brand aligns itself well with any of these figures, it achieves greater resonance in the marketplace. This is something that is widely popular in the industry, and people make a lot of money out of that, multiple companies pitching this similar theory. What is the data? I personally find it very intuitive, very interesting, very intriguing, and has some face validity. What is the data behind it? I have no idea. I have no idea. Okay? And so this is an hypothesis that, to my knowledge, has never been tested. So here's what I mean by the inspired validation path, is that it's okay, it should be okay for us as a field to be looking at some of the truths, about theoretical truths that are widely accepted in the industries, and check them ourselves. and say, you know what, let's make a hypothesis that I can test out of the theories that we take for granted, or the industry takes for granted, and then let's simulate to the real test that we know very well how to design with real data, and then we can tell what is true or it's not true. And that should be regarded as an important contribution that we should make to the field. My number one. The biggest sin I think we have committed as a field is something that I call disregard for content. About 55 years ago, David McClellan wrote in an article in Psych Review, the opening sentence. It says, there used to be a time in which psychology was really about what's going on in people's minds. Okay? What he was complaining about in this article is the fact that most psychology in the second half of the 20th century had become more process-oriented. And this is a problem that is not just from general psychology, it's a problem that is extremely pervasive in our field. Okay? We are master developers of process theories. Okay? We know, for example, that if data patterns do not align with our knowledge structure as consumers, it's going to be hard for us to learn it. Now, we don't care about knowledge structures, but we just care about the process. We know that if feelings are relevant for a judgment, they tend to be used in a judgment. What feelings? Doesn't really matter. We know that if goals conflict, it's very hard to pursue self-regulation. What are the goals? Doesn't matter. I'd like us to think collectively that content does matter. Content does matter, and then especially in a field like ours, we should be much more concerned about content. If you go to people in industry, they don't want to know about processes. They want to tell me what consumers think. Tell me what they feel. Tell me what their goals are. What do they want? This is the what question that they keep asking us. We're not looking at that at all. And we should not forget that some of the most important contributions in psychology were in fact content-oriented. Go back to the Pyramid of Needs by Maslow, go back to the theories of values, typology of values by Rockish, the famous Milgram experiments of obedience, first work on psychoanalytic theories, Jose's work on dimensions of cultures. All those theories had an enduring life, largely, I think, because they were content-rich as opposed to process-rich. So I'd like to sort of share with you a personal story, and it's the only one that I want to share here, of how I learned my lesson the hard way. Okay? Once in a while you get lucky, you get one paper that gets cited. Okay? And this one, for me, happened to me with one paper with Raj Raghunathan on the differences between anxiety and sadness. Okay? And I didn't know at the time, and when I reflect back, why is it that this paper in particular was well cited? It has to do, if I think back, with the fact that the paper was about describing a content-rich difference between anxiety and sadness in terms of motivation and application for decision-making. It was a content-oriented paper. Now, the idea of positioning the paper that way was not mine. It was Raj. Okay? My idea was, let's try to position it as an affect, as information paper. That's the way I sort of look at the world. And Raj was smart enough back then, maybe still is, to push me back and say, no, that's not the way we're going to be doing that. And there's no question in my mind that had we positioned it the way I wanted it, it would have actually not been hardly ever cited. I want to give you another example. It's a paper by someone in the room here, Vivad is in the back here. It's a paper by Noah Goldstein, Bob Cialdini, and Vlad Krishkevicius. Okay? It's a very simple paper. It's a great pair of field studies about what makes people recycle the towels in hotels. Okay? So they went to the hotel and changed different designs, manipulated designs. And what they found is that what forms of request, which involves social norm, most people recycle, okay, turned out to be much more effective than other forms of messages that have been used by the industry. Now, if you look at that paper carefully, the process richness is actually very thin. And I would say it doesn't really matter. What was the paper? The paper got a major award for the JCR. It's by far the most cited article in that year in JCR. And the reason why that paper, I love it, because actually it was telling us something about content, the kind of content that consumers were responding to. So let me sort of recap what I'm recommending as a path for improving our field collectively. And again, this is something that I see as a roadmap for myself, not just a roadmap for everybody else. Okay? More field studies with real consumers and fewer scenario studies. Beware of theories of studies, both as authors as well as reviewers and editors. encourage replications and robustness testing, do not over-generalize published results, expand your focus to non-purchase dimension of consumer behavior, okay? A broader set of perspective beyond information processing and BDT, and I would say even beyond affect, okay? Less emphasis on unique explanations and micro-level explanations. We need also more phenomenon-based research, providing it is robust and grounded in CB, more support for descriptive research, and then a greater tolerance for those inspired tests of pervasive theories that the industry seems to espouse to. But finally, I recommend we also pay much more attention to the content of consumer behavior, and that means we have to be a bit less generalizable, be more specific. It's just the way Noah and Vlad and Bob did when they went into the hotel industry to make a meaningful statement within that context. I'd like to end by suggesting that one more thing. This may be controversial, but perhaps not too much. I think a lot of the problems that I see in our field have their root cause in our incentive structure. Okay? Too much incentive is placed on publishing the more A-level papers as you can. Okay? So here's two CVs, hypothetical CVs of two researchers. There's a red-hot researcher that has published 11 A's article. The other researcher B only 5 A's. And there's no question, and I've been in many promotion committees, and I've read a lot of letters, and I sort of know how people give awards, all those things. Okay? We know that as a field, we just say this guy on the left is hot. This guy or this gal on the right, good, but not as successful as the one on the left. Now, the reason we're doing that is because the arithmetic is very simple. Right? It's easy to count the papers. So what are the alternatives? Well, alternatives are to start to pay attention to other metrics. And citations, of course, is one we should be looking at. So it's a very simple way of looking at citations that I recommend that we start paying attention to. Let's assume we look at this following plot here that I described earlier, and look at these two researchers' papers, how they line up on this chart. And that's not necessarily very visible, but you find that the red-hot researcher, the red bars, tend to be skewed toward the right-hand side of that chart. But the person has 11 papers. Okay? The person who is the yellow researcher only has 5 papers. Okay? You can see that their papers are heavily concentrated toward the left side of the chart. So a metric that would reward researchers and encourage and support researchers based on this kind of location on the chart like this, I think would be very helpful. Okay? What is the percent or rank of the papers that you have published, okay, compared to another researcher? And once you see data this way, I think you're going to get more appreciation for the people who seeming maybe publishing fewer papers but are making papers that are at least interesting to ourselves. Okay? So that is the food for thoughts, and hopefully this is something that will pick up in the field as we move forward. Okay? So let me end by saying that if we were to do this as a roadmap, my prediction is that someone is going to have a nice job 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to be back on this stage, and we'll have actually a slightly more uplifting message. Because we would have moved hopefully in the toward the lower right quadrant of this table. Okay, so I just want to end this presentation by acknowledging some individuals. I just want to acknowledge the people that I've worked most closely with at SCP over the last 2 years: Vicky, LJ, Darren, Tiffany, Larry, and of course Raj and Tom, who've done a fabulous job at putting this conference together. And I also want to mention two people that are very important to me. It's my family, so my wife May, Olivier, and Ludovic, who have been very strong sort of support and very patient with me, who are very good also at keeping in check and saying, you know what, you got to keep things in perspective. I had a conversation with my family recently about the address, and as my son Olivier correctly pointed out and reminded me of, it's just a speech. Okay? So thank you all for being very patient with me, and so thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you.